If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. So Murph, when did you become interested in aviation?
Well, my road to the cockpit was a little bit different probably than some of your guests. I wasn't dreaming about being a fighter pilot, as a young man or in my early childhood. I was an athlete, thought I was going to be a professional baseball player. I'd always been infatuated with airplanes and built models as a kid and was, really infatuated with World War II fighters. And back in my era, used to love to watch Baba Black Sheep and that type of stuff. But dreaming to be a fighter pilot was not in my cross-check at the time. It was all about athletics. So it was really unusual. I didn't end up getting drafted. I went on scholarship to the University of Kentucky, which is a Division I school here in the United States. So played at a really high level. The expectation was to get drafted and to play pro ball. But I had to limp back to my small farming community in central Kentucky and look everybody in the eyeballs and say, I didn't have what it took, so I didn't make it. And so that led me down the road of work. And I went to work selling copiers and facsimiles, if you remember what those were, door to door to small rural companies throughout Kentuckiana. And was very successful at doing that. It was great training. But I was just not a happy guy. I mean, I'd always envisioned myself doing something not everybody could do, high performance. I was used to rigor and discipline. In my athletic background, I didn't really quite see that in my sales role working for Toshiba of America. So I met a fighter pilot, actually, and this person just made a huge impression on me. And I said, well, there's somebody doing something that not everybody can do, higher calling. I was very patriotic growing up in the southern part of the United States. So this really appealed to me. And so I went out and started taking flying lessons and started, studying and looking at what it would take to maybe get into the Air Force, Navy, the Marines. And I had already graduated and I was out of school for almost 2 years at this point. And then the movie Top Gun came out. And I remember, in great detail, in living color with passion and everything else, a movie that I thought maybe I could fit into at some point, but it was the fuel that I needed. And so I started looking harder at it, and I went in to see my Air Force recruiter, and first questions they asked me were, hey, do you have a 3.5 GPA or above? Are you an engineer major in engineering? I said, no. So I went next door and talked to the Navy, and they started asking me about my athletic background, and they said, yes. So took their test. And actually got accepted to get an AOCS slot in the Navy. And I was pretty fired up about that. And then I was my girlfriend at the time lived down in Atlanta, Georgia. And I went down to see her and just had an accidental run-in with an Air National Guard pilot there that was flying F-15s in Atlanta. And if you're a Southern boy, Atlanta's your New York.
Right.
And he convinced me not to go into the Navy and to try to rush his Guard unit. And he said, look, man, very few people know about this Guard Baby program, but if you're lucky enough for a Guard unit that flies fighters like ours to sponsor you, we'll send you to pilot training. You'll go through your 2 years worth of training, come back here, and you can fly, one of the greatest jets on the planet. And he goes, it's super competitive. And, because of this movie, Top Gun, everybody and their brothers trying to get in to do this. But, and I think they had over 300 applicants at the time.
Wow.
So I spent the next year rushing the unit, year and a half, and was lucky enough to get selected to go out of all those applicants. And it was just a huge moment and, great opportunity for me. So I went into the normal Air Force UPT pipeline, fighter lead-in, F-15 RTU, and came back to the Georgia Air National Guard as an F-15 pilot.
So for the folks, our viewers and the people at home, what's the difference between the National Guard and the Air Force? Is there a big difference there?
I would say there is a big difference. Now the training, the jets, the protocol, the standards, the rigor, it's all there. And when I was in, the Guard was, very much on par as far as, missions and going to flags and, obviously getting called into combat. However, the difference is that you're in one place, and I was in Atlanta, Georgia. So I was in the Georgia Air National Guard, and it's kind of a dual role mission because you have a state responsibility. Now we are flying a national asset like the F-15, so but a lot of the troops and security and engineering folks, they could be deployed locally in the state to support anything that might happen in the state from a disaster perspective or anything else. But we were, a federal asset as well in the Air Force with the F-15, and we are what you called a GP unit, at least my unit in the 116th Fighter Wing, the Georgia Air National Guard. We were General Purpose F-15 unit, which meant, we were just like, an Eglin or a Langley as far as their mission is concerned. Mm-hmm. And, we had a protocol to deploy anywhere in the world within 72 hours. And, we had 40 plus F-15 pilots, and it was kind of nice about the Guard for a young lieutenant like me is the Guard kind of handpicked the best guys on the active duty that wanted to move to Atlanta, maybe fly for Delta. So we were pretty stacked with experience. We had some really phenomenal Eagle drivers, and at the time, some guys that were famous or infamous, however you want to look at it. So it was a great environment for a young lieutenant to thrive and learn.
Before we got onto the F-15 here, Murph, so could a Delta pilot go on to fly the F-15 or whatever, the F-16s in the Guard, or did you already have to go through the stream of fighter first and then you go to commercial?
Well, so that's a great question. So the typical route for the Guard or the reserves here in the United States is you're in active duty, you do your tour in active duty, you go get a job like an airline job, but you still want to stay in, you still want to fly fighters and have that extra revenue stream for your family. So you join the Guard or the reserves. That's why we get a lot of experienced folks coming in, captains, majors, with 500 to 1,500 hours in a platform. However, and it's fairly, I wouldn't say rare, but on limited occasions, a unit every 2 years or so will sponsor a local person and send him or her through pilot training. And it's usually somebody local in the community and have them come back as a lieutenant, because you can't be top heavy all the time in your squadron. You need a snack go, you need people to do the beer run. So we need lieutenants and we need youth in the squadron. So those Guard babies, if you will, are folks that unit raised first, 2 years of active duty in the Air Force, going through all the training protocols, but then they come back to that unit. And typically a Guard baby then stays active duty for several years until they at least get through Flight Lead Upgrade Program or maybe IPUG, or the Instructor Pilot Upgrade Program. And then they're turned loose to go out and get a real job, if you will. And then they can choose to be a traditional reservist or Guard person and fly 8 to 12 sorties a month. Or they also could be full-time as well. So you could be active duty or technician, if you will, full-time in a Guard or reserve unit. It's pretty cool. It's really cool. So I highly recommend it to any young people that are listening right now in the United States. If you're interested in flying, especially if you're interested in flying a specific airframe, you can kind of pick a Guard unit or a reserve unit and then go rush that unit. Now, it's not an easy process. And I would say when I was doing it, the chances of getting through that process was a lot harder than through the active duty. But it's super rewarding.
So, Murph, you obviously went on to fly the F-15A, I think it was. What were your first thoughts of the Eagle?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's it. Wow. Awesome. Incredible. It was just an unbelievable machine. I mean, you certainly felt like Superman in the jet because you just point it and it goes where you want it to go. It was a very easy airplane to fly, stick and rudder. And yeah, we did use the rudder in the Eagle, especially in slow speed fight. But it was a very demanding aircraft to employ as a weapon system. The one that I flew was fairly steam driven. I flew the F-15A and then the MISSIP F-15, which was, almost to the F-15C capabilities as far as the stuff that we had on the jet. But we had the older motors with DACTs with digital controls on them. But we were lighter, I think about 500 pounds lighter than the C. So it was an awesome machine and just a great jet. I mean, I could just go on and on. I mean, just an awesome airplane.
Absolutely.
What I loved about the Eagle too is it would talk to you. I mean, when you're in the buffet, you're in the buffet. I mean, the thing's shaking and rolling. When you're fast, the wind noise is amazing. I mean, the airplane was very visceral. I mean, it was very hands-on. It talked to you. You knew where you were in the flight envelope. If you're looking over and, or you're over your shoulder or you're somewhere else in, the BFM bubble or the ACM bubble, you could feel almost whether you're from corner speed down to 200 knots, the airplane, gave you a lot of feedback. It was very cool to fly.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So could you talk us through some of your ground and flying training on the Eagle, and did you take to it quite easy?
I did. I was very lucky. It came very natural for me. And school didn't, growing up as an athlete, that story I told you earlier. So I was very intimidated when I showed up to pilot training with all these academy guys and, all these folks that did very well in school and wanted to be a fighter pilot since they were in their early ages. But once I got in the cockpit and started flying, everything really, really fell in place. And I feel like probably my athletic career helped a lot. And even things like my hobbies, like hunting and fishing, but hunting and some of the shooting sports that I enjoyed doing, I think all those things came together and really helped, especially when I progressed through undergraduate pilot training. Back then, they were 2-track. We had FAR, fighter attack reconnaissance, for the fast-moving guys, fast jets, and then transport bombers and training and our other aircraft in another pipeline. So then you kept flying the T-38 and the AT-38, the attack role at Holloman Air Force Base is where I went through fighter lead-in training. And then I was actually at RTU at Luke Air Force. I think I might have been the last RTU class or one of the last RTU classes there. We had the triple nickel and the 426 Killer Claws. I was in the 426th and went through RTU there. And that's where I really feel like I came into my own. I really, connected with the Eagle early on, and that type of flying, the air-to-air role, really suited me. It was very physical, and I think maybe by nature I'm a little ADHD, so the focus that it required, the compartmentalization at times, I think it really supported my personality and where I was in my life at that time. So it was a great jet, and it did come fairly easy for me. And then when I went back to my squadron, like I told you, it was a very experienced squadron. We had a lot of patch wearers in our squadron, maybe more than maybe any other F-15 unit at the time. I don't know. That could certainly be challenged, but we had a lot. Patch wearer meaning fighter weapons school, Top Gun grads, if you will, if you're a Navy guy, but our fighter weapons school guys. So the environment was a great environment to learn in. It was extremely competitive, and it was a big boy approach. I had my really good classmate in UPT, Joe Meraki. He graduated #1 in our class, and we tracked together in the Eagle, and he went back to a frontline Eagle squadron, Eglin Air Force Base. And when we compare logbooks and sorties and upgrades, because I think I grew up in a guard unit, I was a 4-ship flight lead, an instructor pilot way earlier than I would have ever been on the active duty. So the amount of responsibility that I was given early on in my Eagle career was pretty amazing. And we flew a ton. Every single day we were flying 4VX DACTs, against, Buford Hornets or against the Swamp Fox F-16 Big Mouse up at the South Carolina Air National Guard. We had active duty F-16s at Shaw, at Moody, Gold Canopy. All the different variants of the Falcon, and we deployed a lot as well. So my unit was, I think, the first Eagle unit to deploy with the fight against drugs in the early 90s. We went down to the jungles of Panama and ran after drug runners. We were the first unit, I think, to use night vision goggles in a fighter cockpit. I remember those really early years with NVGs and the big battery packs in our map case. And we went to Maple Flag and deployed to Turkey in 1991. We were in Balıkesir. Got a chance to fly over in Singapore with Singapore Sling, and just did some really cool stuff.
Yeah, I want to get into a bit of detail about that because I'm fascinated with DACT and all that kind of stuff. But I have to ask you one question. Can you remember your first takeoff, your first performance takeoff in the Eagle? That must have been incredible.
Yeah, and we did them quite often. What's great about the Guard, too, is on the weekends, back in these days, we are allowed to take jets cross country. And I would take them really anywhere you want to go. Now, we would do air refueling training, and we would match it up with training squares as well. But, I flew in many air shows and did many unrestricted climbs. But, anytime you do it lightweight on a cold day and you don't have tanks and you're clean in the F-15, and I did several of those were unbelievably memorable because it's hard to get the airplane even cleaned up, get the gear up, the gear doors, and the flaps up before you hit, 480 knots. You're 6,000, 7,000 feet down the runway on a 9,000 foot runway and you're pulling. And I remember several times being in full blower, full afterburner, and getting the nose up. And as soon as I got the nose up vertical, pulling the throttles out of burner and still going. And this is a cold day, clean, but it's an awesome airplane. Now, fully loaded with tanks, I mean, it's a whole different creature. But when you're clean on a cold day, the Eagle's pretty impressive. It will absolutely plaster you in the seat.
I can imagine.
That's for sure.
And I've spoke to many F-15 guys and gals, and did you fly with, when you did fly with tanks, a centerline tank? Because I think later on they became the wing tanks, but I think in their early-ish days, wasn't it just a centerline?
Yeah, almost every sortie was with a centerline bag, 660 gallons, I think, 2,850 pounds, if I remember correctly. I can't remember, but then we'd fly 3 bags. Anytime we do long deployments, I did that quite often. And then in my later years, we started going with the 2-bag configuration on the wings. You're right. Mm-hmm. And we did that fairly early when we were doing the intercepts down in Panama. So I remember flying with 2 bags fairly early. I would say in the early 90s when it wasn't so typical. But when I left the Georgia Guard, then went into the Florida Guard in the last few years of my career, we were flying 2 bags, on a regular basis as a typical mix.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned before, you mentioned DACT then, some large exercises. So how did the F-15 fare against, the Hornets and the F-16s like you mentioned?
Oh, Mike, we beat everybody. Nobody could touch us. Of course that's the right answer. Yeah. Everybody's dead. It was a great airplane. Now, I have to caveat this when I flew, so, it's a different ball game now.
Yeah.
I was flying semi-active radars, AIM-7s. I was flying early lot AMRAAMs. As a matter of fact, I think I shot one of the first, if not the first AMRAAM ever on a Mississippi Eagle. So, I got to go through those tactics, the old world tactics, where we'd go out on a BFM sortie and the old timer would say, we're Papas and guns today, AIM-9 Papas. But, I flew with Mikes and never flew with an X. But we, in a DCA scenario, pre-strike sweep, cap, all these roles that we would fly in, it was phenomenal. And, I feel like when I was in the Eagle, even at the end of my career, I felt like, every single day we were going to go up and fight, we're going to win. I mean, I just felt 100% confident we were going to win. Now, if you're going to go fly BFM 1v1 with a Swamp Fox and F-16 up in South Carolina when they got their new model F-16s, well, that's a different story.
Yeah.
And, but I flew, against Hornets on a regular basis. Never flew against the MiG-29, though a lot of my friends, flew against the MiG-29. But from my era, anyways, I felt like we were, the big dog in the sky for sure. There were times in BFM scenarios where I didn't feel like, we had the advantage, but for the most part, because that's all we did is flew BFM, ACT, DACT every single day, I felt like, we were top of our game. And I felt like we were in the right jet, the right platform, the right weapon system, the right radar, the right raw gear. I mean, we had just great systems.
Absolutely. And did you ever get to train with the RAF or any other European nations?
No, but the best piano player and the best bar and crud player I think I ever met in my life was a guy call sign Loins. He was a RAF exchange pilot. He was an RTU instructor at the 426th. But that's it. I did get a chance to go fly with the Red Arrows. So
Nice.
I got to fly a pre-workup, full air show gig with the Red Arrows in the backseat of a Hawker. So that was really cool. But that's the only time that I've interfaced with the RAF.
Yeah, it's crazy. You sort of I got to fly with the Red Arrows. Like, people would dream for that. It's incredible.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah, I was up in Canada when I did that. Red Arrows were over, and I knew a guy pretty well that was on the Red Arrows. So we did that. I think what struck me the most about that was, for the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels, from what I could tell at the time, there's a lot of comm on the radios, and the flight lead's talking a lot to have prerequisites on each maneuver. But what struck me about the Red Arrows is they briefed on the wingtip. So everybody gathered around a wing, and I think it was raining that day, and we did our briefing, which was cool. And pretty much it was standard. So it was pretty much the briefing was, okay, standard. I think we had a couple of admin and some unusual things to brief, but for the most part, it went really quickly. We stepped to the jet, and when I flew with the Red Arrows, a lot of stuff was done on a mic zipper, and so lots of clicks, which was really cool, and that struck me. And then the Hawker was a neat little jet. I was surprised at how quickly it get his energy back. You push the stick up a little less than 1G, it accelerates. It was a neat little jet for sure.
Brilliant stuff. So, Murph, you mentioned there a couple of deployments there. I think you mentioned Singapore and I think was it Maple Flag. Can you tell us how you felt going to these big exercises and going abroad?
Well, Maple Flag was an eye opener for me because I went there as a young flight lead, and it was heavy work, and it was very challenging. But the flying was unbelievable. I mean, to see that many airplanes in the sky and that small of a piece of airspace, and to have that experience that, hey, this is close to the rigors that we're going to expect in combat, was just unbelievable. I also really liked it because a lot of the NATO nations were participating, so it wasn't just an American exercise. So, we got a chance to, I guess that was one occasion. I think there were tornadoes there. I can't remember what RAF platform was there, but there were folks from all over the world there, which was a great experience. And I think what I remember most is almost winning the Crud Championship and seeing one of my teammates, I don't know if he got thrown out of the window, but almost got close to thrown out of the window. It was very, it was a big boy experience. I remember the crud table at Maple Flag.
Wow. Can you maybe talk us through a brief and a debrief in the F-15, and how would you relate it to what you're currently doing in business now?
Well, I started a company 27 years ago called Afterburner. And I started that company because the frameworks that I learned growing up, learning to fly a fighter, and then the frameworks that I saw the squadron and even the wing use to survive, thrive, and dominate in the sky were repeatable frameworks that I thought I could use when I was playing baseball, but even more importantly, when I was working in corporate America. And I realized it was a powerful model, performance model, and a simple model, because that simplicity would beat the complexity of combat. And I realized it was an accelerant. It could accelerate not only individuals and small teams, but entire enterprises. And most companies, especially large enterprises, publicly traded companies, really struggle with alignment and execution. I mean, they just really struggle with it. And I saw these frameworks that I learned in the Air Force, and I saw how high of a level we were executing in a really inefficient enterprise, the U.S. government. I thought it was amazing. How could they find these pockets of unbelievable excellence in this big, giant enterprise called the government of the United States? So I decided to make a career out of that, wrote a lot of books about it, and teach corporations around the world, 26 countries. I think we've trained over 2.5 million people.
Wow.
The rigors and the simple frameworks that I learned as a fighter pilot, and we apply them to business. The business model is called Flawless Execution, and it's the title of one of the books that I've wrote. But the briefing and the debriefing are cornerstone tenets in our model, which is plan, brief, execute, debrief in a cycle. So think Boyd's OODA loop, but this is a little bit differently. Planning using 6 steps, briefing right before you go fly, last step of alignment and accountability, executing the pre-brief plan in a task-saturated environment, and most importantly, debriefing immediately following. Mm-hmm. And the debriefing must be like the debriefings we had in the Air Force. They have to be a psychologically safe environment so the brand new lieutenant or the one-star general can freely admit their errors in the open without the fear of reprimand or anything else to get the team better. And we rarely see that in corporations. So I learned that process and realized that would be a powerful business model. So how does the briefing and debriefing the F-15 world work? Well, the briefing was amazing. Everything that we do flying jets is very standardized, so it's scalable. Another lesson for businesses. So the briefing format was very scalable. We learned that, hey, when you first walk in, you're always on time. And the door closes right when the brief starts. And if you're late, you don't fly that day. You're left outside the room. Makes a big impression, because if the briefing starts late or is sloppy and we step late and we taxi late and we take off late, then we are irrelevant. I mean, absolutely irrelevant, right? So that made a big impression on me as well. So briefings always start on time. They're never late. And if not, you don't participate. So sloppy briefing, sloppy execution. Mm-hmm. So the briefings were tight. And we used to practice them. And the best flight leads were some of the best briefers because they clearly laid out the plan. So the briefing would start with some motherhood and here's the weather today. Here's our threats today. Here's how we're going to start taxi, takeoff, and RTB. If it was outside of our normal squadron standards, if not, all the flight lead had to say is STTO, start, takeoff, and RTB are going to be standard. We always would brief the emergencies in case there were any particular highlights, and we always briefed an ejection and rest cap, because if you've ever been in that situation, and I have, where somebody's ejecting and you're providing rest cap, which I've done before, there's a lot of adrenaline flowing when you see one of your buddies blow up next to you. So you better have this down as rope memory. So we always briefed the ejection and the rest cap procedures in a briefing. And then the flight lead would get into the actual tactics that we're going to employ today. So today we're going against an unknown number of bandits, and we know the bandits are going to be, F-18s simulating flankers and floggers, or flankers and fulcrums. And here are the way we know these jets are going to be loaded out: A-10 long burns against our AMRAAMs. Here are the tactics we're going to employ, and we usually tied it to some sort of real world scenario. Something was happening in the world. So we're going to take off from this base over here. We're going to do a combat air patrol situation over this area. This is our lane of responsibility, and then we get into the specific tactics. And the flight lead would brief everything from how we're going to communicate, how we're going to commit on the bandits, when we're going to say we're offensive, neutral, or defensive, whether we're going to stick into the fight, we're going to notch or abort, come back in. There are all these different things that we would go through, and then the briefing would end, and then we would step to the jet. And the briefing really struck me because, when you ask any high performance person, and I've written a bunch of books on organizational execution, so I started interviewing athletes and business people, some of the top CEOs, famous CEOs that we've all heard of. And when I started asking these high performance individuals how they execute, I got a bunch of different answers. But when you ask a fighter pilot, how do you execute the mission? They look at you almost stunned. They go, well, I execute the pre-brief plan. I execute the brief. I mean, I know what I'm going to execute because we briefed everything in minute detail. I even know what I'm going to do if things go wrong. Mm-hmm. It's been briefed. So that made a big impression on me. And the execution phase of being a fighter pilot is bookended with a great brief, the preparatory step to execution, the last step of alignment and accountability, and then more importantly, the debrief in a nameless, rankless environment where we deconstruct everything that happened, because rarely does this ever happen like we say it's going to happen. So the briefing and the actual debrief is where we close gaps, the gaps between the expectation, the briefing based on real combat, or the training scenario we just went through. So the debriefing, the purpose of that is to get our expectation for the next mission closer to reality. We're trying to close execution gaps. And that's the purpose of the debrief. So when the debrief is over, we take those lessons learned, we publish them to other squadron members so they don't make the same mistakes we did when they step out the very next 30 minutes, the next hour, the next day on a mission. So they execute at a much higher level based on the lessons you and I just learned on today's sortie.
Very fascinated with that, especially the debrief, because I've heard from mud movers that the worst thing would be to be sitting into an air-to-air debrief, looking at every kill. Don't know how true that is from the mud movers, but obviously coming off the debrief, is there any time where a pilot or even a wizzo was completely done from that mission where they couldn't sit in that debrief, or did they have to do it? They couldn't say, like, I'm absolutely buggered, I can't sit here for XYZ hours.
I can't even imagine that scenario,
right?
Because the debrief is almost as important as the flight itself. So all the energy, all the fuel, all the money, all the investment, all the training goes into those very few sorties that you get to participate in as a fighter pilot. And the debrief is where we take the lessons and we expand them, and where we get better. Because when you debrief properly, you don't get a 3 to 5% piece of improvement. You don't get, even a revolutionary piece of improvement. You get an evolutionary piece of improvement. When you debrief, we just get exponentially better. So you think about every single sortie that you ever fly as a fighter pilot, every single one, we always debrief. And I would say that's especially if you looked in the early years of military aviation, jet aviation anyways, where we are killing more pilots in training than we were in combat. The debrief was probably the single most important thing we instilled back in those days to get aviation to where it is today.